population of Simbirsk, a city on the Volga River, more than 400 miles from Moscow, numbered around 27,000 people in the year of Lenin's birth. It had never seen population uprisings and was nicknamed the Lord on the Volga. The journalist Alexander Zhurkevich described Simbirsk as follows: "Having read the novel Oblomov, I'm convinced that Goncharov would never have written it if he himself had not been enamored with his dream, with this quiet, vegetative life of the provinces." The slumber of the 1860s was disrupted by explosive debates along the intelligentsia regarding the ignorance of the masses. The governorate of Simbirsk had just one primary school for every 3 villages. Vladimir Lenin, called Volodya, was born on April 10, 1870. He was the family's 4th child. His father, Ilya, was a director of public schools and a supporter of equal universal access to education. He believed that an honest and humanistically inclined individual had a useful role to play, even under Tsarist autocracy. Volodya's mother, Maria, spoke multiple languages and knew literature well. She was certified as a teacher. The Ulyanovs drifted from one rented apartment to another until, in 1878, they bought their own home on Moskovskaya Street. In time, the family grew to include 6 children: Anna, Vladimir, Alexander, Dmitry, Olga, and Maria. All of them, except Olga, who died young, would become revolutionaries. As Alexander Naumov, a high school student, recalled, although Ulyanov was rather upbeat by nature, he was reserved and treated his fellow students coldly. He befriended no one, addressing everyone using the formal pronoun "вы." In January 1886, his father, Ilya, died. 1 year later, another misfortune befell the family. Alexander Ulyanov, a student at St. Petersburg University, was arrested for involvement in an attempted assassination of the emperor. In court, he testified, "Terror is a form of struggle born of the 19th century. It is the only form of defensive available to a minority whose power is limited to spiritual strength and the certainty of being in the right." His mother, Maria, was present in the courtroom when these words were spoken. At dawn on May 8, 1877, Alexander and 4 of his comrades were executed.
As Maria wrote, Volodya responded to this by saying, "We will take a different path."
Upon graduating high school with Golden Medal, Vladimir Ulyanov enrolled at Kazan University. As his classmate Nikolai Alexeyev recalled, he was a hardened, implacable enemy of the Tsar's rule and regime. He never spoke harshly with anyone, but his sarcastic remarks could cut to the quick. On December 4th, Ulyanov was arrested for taking part in a student assembly. He was expelled from the university and exiled to his grandfather's estate at Kukushkina, where he remained under police supervision. He was allowed to return to Kazan some 8 months later. In Kazan, Vladimir thought out a group headed by local Marxist Nikolai Fedoseev. He didn't even know what he looked like, since the members of the circle kept their real names a secret. In July of 1889, they were all arrested.
On that occasion, as his sister Anna recalled, Ilyich was saved when our entire family moved in May to the governorate of Samara.
In the tiny village of Alakeyevka, Vladimir wrote his first major work, New Economic Developments in Peasant Life. This is Lenin's earliest extant literary work. In it, the 23-year-old author attempts to show that bourgeois economy with the relationship becoming firmly rooted in the peasantry. By this time, the Russian working class had swelled to 1.5 million in number. Compared with European workers, they were subject to particularly harsh exploitation. A major strike had already shaken the Sava Morozov textile factory. In September of 1889, the Ulyanov family moved to the city of Samara itself. Vladimir joined a circle of populists and recruited like-minded people to the cause. In 1891, he passed the exams for all his courses at St. Petersburg University as an external student and received a law degree with honors. In August of 1893, the Ulyanovs moved to Moscow, while Vladimir moved to Petersburg. The the Russian working class already numbered 2 million. Workers had traded one form of serfdom on landed estates for another, in factories and workshops, where the workday could last from 12 to 14 hours.
As his sister Anna wrote, he sought out people who were firmly convinced that the revolution would be brought about either by the working class or not at all.
At Petersburg Marxism, Gleb Krzyzanowski recalled Vladimir Ilyich was given the nickname Old Man for his balding head and tremendous erudition. Ulyanov began holding classes in Marxist literature at Petersburg's Nevskaya Zastava neighborhood, in workers' apartment, Marx, Engels, Kautsky, Plekhanov. As Ivan Babushkin recalled, in his lectures he laid out an entire science for us, with eloquent words and without a notebook. In Moscow, Ulyanov opposed a prominent populist Vasily Vorontsov and appeared in police reports as the brother of a hangman. The underground Marxists were joined by so-called legal Marxists, including Alexander Portrasov. Despite their disagreements, Ulyanov formed a temporary coalition with them. At one of their gatherings, Vladimir made the acquaintance of Nadezhda Krupskaya, the daughter of the retired Lieutenant Konstantin Krupskoy. She was a working Sunday school teacher. In May of 1894, Ulyanov submitted the manuscript for the brochure What the Friends of the People Are and How They Fight the Social Democrats for publication in the underground press. In it, he first proposed the creation of a Marxist Workers' Party. To strengthen ties with the Emancipation of Labor group founded in exile by Grigory Plekhanov, Ulyanov moved to Geneva in early May of 1895. Plekhanov was the first propagandist of Marxism in Russia and saw the proletariat as the leading revolutionary force. In a letter to the Plekhanovites, Friedrich Engels heralded the group, which had adopted Marxist theories without reservation. Marx himself, he wrote, would have been proud to see it had he lived a little longer. In Zurich, Ulyanov met Pavel Axelrod. In Paris, the French Marxist Paul Lafargue. And in Berlin, the prominent German Social Democrat Wilhelm Liebknecht. As Plekhanov said regarding his visitor from Petersburg, a young comrade had arrived. He's very smart, well-educated, and has a way with words. Vladimir Ilyich returned to Petersburg on September 7th with illegal literature hidden in his suitcase. In October of 1895, he visited the central office of the Union for the Struggle of Liberating Working Class. The union disseminated pamphlets and led the strike movement. On the night of December 9th, all of the union's ringleaders were arrested. In January, Krupskaya, Babushkin, and others followed. The strikes were not in vain, Ulyanov wrote from prison. They did a tremendous service to Russian workers. They taught them to understand the working class's political predicament and political needs. While in prison, Vladimir Ilyich began to write the book, The Development of Capitalism in Russia. Vladimir Ulyanov was released from prison 14 months later, whereupon he posed for a picture with his comrades. By imperial command, he was to be exiled to eastern Siberia for 3 years. Maria Alexandrovna won permission for her son to travel at his own expense and alone with the official travel permit instead of under armed guard. On March 4, 1897, Ulyanov arrived at Krasnoyarsk. He stayed for a time at the home of Popova, known as a refugee for political exiles. On April 30th, once the rivers became navigable, he set out by steamboat along the Yenisei River, and a week later he was in Minusinsk. From there, he was taken to Shushenskoye. It was said of the old village that there is nowhere more nowhere than Shusha. Beyond Shusha are the Sayan Mountains, and beyond them the edge of the world. Vladimir Ilyich was given a room in the home of the peasant Zyryanov, a bed, a table, and 4 chairs. Herman Ushakov, a scholar who researched Lenin's exile in Shushenskoye, wrote that the new resident kept to himself but remained high-spirited and was the picture of health. Later, though, his mood changed and he confessed to Zyryanov that he missed his fiancée. Nadezhda Krupskaya's prison sentence expired in February of 1898. She was granted permission to wait out her exile at Shushenskoye instead of Ufa. She arrived there in early May along with her mother Yelizaveta. They held a wedding in a village style and rented out half of peasant woman Petrova's house, complete with a garden. As Ushakov wrote, Vladimir Ilyich enjoyed a secluded, out-of-the-way room and freedom from any involvement in the daily affairs of the household. Whether secretly or openly, Ulyanov visited the colonies of exiles in Minusinsk and Tessinskoye. Questions discussed at these meetings were whether or not to unite the Social Democrats into a single, tight-knit party. In February 1999, Ulyanov sent the final chapters of his book, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, to Petersburg. In defiance of the populists who painted an idyllic picture of the village commune, he argued that the peasantry was being split in two irreconcilable camps, the village bourgeoisie and the wage-laboring proletariat. Russia was becoming the target of German and English industrial expansion. As Ulyanov noted, the development of capitalism in Russia was sluggish and could hardly have been otherwise, since no other capitalist country has managed to preserve so many anachronistic institutions that are incompatible with capitalism and impede its development. Vladimir Ilyich wrote that capitalism had come to set the tone for all economic life in Russia and brought with it bitter contradictions. It was unavoidable that the proletariat would stand at the forefront of the revolution. It was immeasurably stronger in its numbers in terms of percentage of the population might suggest. The populists eventually gave way to the economists, followers of the English trade unions. They prompted the idea that the government was not the workers' enemy. In August of 1899, at the gathering in the village of Yermakovskaya, 17 exiles signed a protest of Russian Social Democrats, in which they dismissed economism as the suicide of Russian social democracy. The rank of comrades in the Minusinsk colony was dwindling. Anatoly Vaniev died of tuberculosis. Cousin Marxist Fedoseev also died, having bequeathed his manuscripts to Vladimir Ilyich.
Ulyanov authored a draft of the party's platform. Above all, he pushed for the publication of a nationwide Marxist newspaper. Vladimir Ilyich no longer slept and grew terribly thin, recalled Krupskaya. He spent many a sleepless night thinking over his plan down to the smallest detail.
In early January of 1900, the police notified Ulyanov that the exile was over, but living in major cities remained prohibited. In their place, he chose the smaller city of Pskov. On the morning of January 29th, the Ulyanovs left Shushenskoye. On February 2nd, with 200 miles of snow-covered roads behind them, they boarded a train from Irkutsk to Moscow. In late February of 1900, Ulyanov arrived at Pskov. As his comrade-in-arms Pantaleimon Lepeshinsky recalled, he had most impressed the local Pskov statisticians as the author of the outstanding book, The Development of Capitalism in Russia. This was Ulyanov's room at Archangel Street 5. It was there the future newspaper Iskra, or The Spark, took shape. Its mission was to organize a Marxist workers' party. On the eve of his departure from Russia, Vladimir Ilyich paid a visit to Nadezhda, who, along with his relatives in Ufa, where she continued to live in exile. On June 22nd, he arrived in Geneva. The editors of Iskra met at Plekhanov's apartment. The host showered Ulyanov with praise for his ideological route of the economism movement.
Георгий Валентинович, не так уж я хорош.
Plekhanov insisted on a special position on the editorial board. He was granted 2 editorial votes. In late August, Ulyanov arrived in Munich, home of Iskra's editorial office. On the night of December 11, 1900, the first edition of Iskra was printed in Leipzig. Paper copies of mattresses for printing were smuggled into Russia. 50 articles appeared in the newspaper signed by a certain N. Lenin. The economic crisis of the early 20th century, with high unemployment and lockouts, boosted Iskra's appeal among workers. They informed the editorial office that each copy was quite literally read to pieces. The Iskra team was working out a platform for the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party that descries the monarchist government's barbaric exploitation of the people. It opened with the demand that the autocracy be overthrown. In April of 1901, Nadezhda arrived in Munich and began work as a secretary of the editorial board. A year later, the editorial office was moved to London, further from the gaze of the Tsarist secret police. Lenin and Krupskaya rented 2 austere rooms on Halford Square. Another year later, Iskra moved to Geneva. There, in the working-class suburb of Secheron, Vladimir Ilyich was busy with preparations for the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. The Congress was held in July and August of 1903 in Brussels and London. With near unanimity, they adopted the party platform, whose primary aim was the seizure of political power by the proletariat. The first article of the party's constitution came under dispute. Martov believed that anyone who supported the party's platform and provided financial support should become a member. Lenin, on the other hand, insisted that each party member be personally involved in its local organizations. Although Plekhanov supported Lenin, Martov managed to push through his own wording for the article. Thus, immediately after its founding, the party split in two wings, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Plekhanov soon proposed that Lenin allow Martov's supporters to join Iskra. As a sign of protest, Vladimir Ilyich quit the newspaper. As of November 1903, it became a Menshevik mouthpiece.
The Ulyanovs headed to the mountains for a month. Vladimir Ilyich's nerves were restored, Nadezhda observed, as if cleansed by the waters of a mountain stream. Krupskaya added that a furious barking would ring out in a tiny village every evening. It was Ilyich taunting a chained dog as he walked by it.
Lenin continued to strengthen the party. In Geneva, a bureau of majority committees, a Russian Socialist Democratic Labor Party archive, and a printing works were created. In January 1905, a Bolshevik newspaper, Period, or Forward, began publication. Lenin defined its aim as follows: Period will unflinchingly oppose the new Iskra in the name of the old Iskra. Russia had been at war with Japan for a year already. Lenin appealed to the proletariat. The interests of the rapacious bourgeoisie, the interests of the capital, are ready to sell and despoil their homeland, and this is what led to this criminal war. The Russian army, 10 times larger than that of its opponent and paired with a comparably powerful navy, expected a victory in its clash with Imperial Japan in Manchuria and Korea. But by December of 1904, the Japanese army had destroyed the first Russian fleet and taken the fortress of Port Arthur. The war cost 120,000 Russian lives. The collapse of Tsarist militarism had major repercussions in Petersburg. In early January of 1905, the workers of the Putilov Iron Works declared a strike. On January 9th, the priest Grigory Gapon led 300,000 people to Palace Square to deliver a petition to the Tsar. Their foremost ranks were mown down by gunfire. Lenin did not support Gapon's appeal to left-leaning parties for a joint armed reprisal. Once the autocracy is overthrown, he declared, the struggle will not cease, it will intensify. In 1905, all of Russia was threatened by the storms of revolution. The mutiny on the battleship Potemkin, the 70,000-strong strike of textile workers in the town of Ivanovo, the creation of 60 councils of workers and soldiers' deputies. By fall, the potentially motivated strikes had been joined by 2 million people. On October 17th, the Tsar issued the October Manifesto on Civil Freedoms. It was heralded by the liberally-minded nobility, intelligentsia, and bourgeoisie, who founded a party of constitutional democrats, the Cadets. On November 8th, Lenin made his way to Petersburg via Stockholm. He was soon joined by Nadezhda. Vladimir Ilyich met with Maxim Gorky for the first time. The writer had been supporting the Bolsheviks financially since 1902. In Gorky's newspaper, Novaya Zhizn, Lenin warned that the decisive struggle still lay ahead and the party's conspirational apparatus must be maintained. A general strike in Moscow on December 7th culminated in open rebellion. Barricade fighting ensued in Moscow's Presna and Zamoskvorechye districts. Troops dispatched from Petersburg broke the resistance of the insurrectionalists. Revolutionary actions were suppressed in Petersburg, Krasnoyarsk, Nizhny Novgorod, Kharkov, and other cities. A death squad caught Ivan Babushkin on the Trans-Siberian Railway and shot him along with his comrades. In February of 1906, Lenin and Krupskaya moved to the Finnish town of Kuokkala. There, Vladimir Ilyich edited illegal Bolshevik newspaper that was printed in Viborg. In April, Lenin was in Stockholm at the 4th Unity Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Both factions were formally united, though each preserved its own existing structure. On April 27th, the First State Duma convened, with the cadets making up the largest faction. Vladimir Ilyich took a dim view on the occasion. The cadets are the worms in the revolution's grave. They buried the revolution, it's being devoured by worms. The Brotherhood Church in London hosted the 5th Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party in May of 1907, where the relationship with bourgeois parties were debated. Lenin emphasized that the proletariat would seize upon all gains made by democracy. Thus, it was quite inevitable that the bourgeoisie would strive to blunt the edge of revolution. The police were hot on Lenin's trail. In mid-November, he left for the city of Abo, where the Finns arranged his departure for Sweden. He made it to the island of Nagu by horse. There, Vladimir Ilyich boarded a steamboat. In Stockholm, he worked at the Royal Library as he waited for Krupskaya to join him. On December 25th, he returned to Switzerland. In Geneva, Lenin and Krupskaya rented a modestly sized room on Dupont Street.
The Tsarist government dealt harshly with the revolutionaries, wrote Nadezhda. The prisons were overflowing, and one death sentence followed another.
A new philosophy had appeared in Russia, the imperial criticism of the Austrian Ernst Mach. It denied the existence of any external world independent of the human being and viewed human sense and experience as the sole reality. Lenin authored a response to the followers of Mach. In fall of 1908, in a new apartment on the Rue des Marchés, he completed work on the book Materialism and Imperial Criticism. Regarding Bogdanov's work entitled Imperial Modism, Vladimir Ilyich wrote, "If nature is somehow derivative, then it stands to reason that it must be derived from something. This means that something exists beyond nature itself, something which indeed generates it. In plain-spoken Russian, this something is referred to as God." The locals in Geneva would ask Lenin when the new revolution would take place. "The peasant now sits idly sucking his paw," he would answer. "When he stops, the revolution will come." Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin appeared to the so-called sturdy peasant of the Russian village. His new land reform abolished the peasant commune and strengthened private land ownership.
In early December of 1908, the Ulyanovs moved to Paris. "In Paris," wrote Krupskaya, "we faced the most difficult years of emigration. Ilyich was always pained by their memory."
The émigrés were split. The liquidators wanted to replace the illegal party with one more palatable to Stolypin. The recallists wanted to recall all Bolsheviks from the Duma. Finally, the conciliators wanted to reconcile everyone. Lenin believed that the broad masses could not replace the party, that the party was the class vanguard. He posed the question, can the power of 100 exceed that of 1,000? He answered, it can indeed, when that 100 is organized. Organization increases power tenfold. In July 1909, Lenin and Krupskaya rented an inexpensive apartment at 4 Rue Marie Rose, 2 rooms, a kitchen, and an entryway. According to the Bolshevik Mikhail Olminsky, Lenin never maintained any acquaintances among the bourgeoisie. His entire way of life was proletariat, with the possible exception of the piles of books in his room. In January 1910, at the Paris plenum of the Central Committee, the conciliators prevailed. They resolved to dismantle the factions, shut down the Bolshevik center, and seize publication of the proletarian.
The revolutionary Rosalia Zemlyachka recalled, "We who were close to him looked on in pain as he changed physically, as the colossus wavered. Only a small handful of supporters remained around him."
In the summer of 1910, the female revolutionary Inessa Armand arrived in Paris from Brussels. She joined the local party section and lectured in the party school at Longemont some years later. In 1919, when Armand, now emissary of the party Central Committee, died of cholera, Lenin and Krupskaya assumed guardianship of her children. Vladimir Ilyich hadn't seen his mother in 4 years and invited her to meet him in Switzerland. In September of 1910, Maria arrived for a week in Stockholm. This would be the last time she saw her son. Having returned to Paris, Lenin began to raise funds for the newspaper Rabochaya Gazeta, and his first edition was released on October 30th. Russia was experiencing an industrial boom. Politically motivated strikes were also on the rise. According to Lenin's calculation, each worker brought a capitalist an average profit of 252 rubles per year. Meanwhile, the worker's own salary stood at 246 rubles. Lenin concluded that a worker works the lesser part of the day for himself and the greater part for the capitalist. In January of 1912, the 6th conference of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was held in Prague, declared itself a congress, and adopted a resolution affirming the party's illegal status and the expulsion of the liquidators from it. On April 22nd, a new workers' newspaper came out in Petersburg, Pravda. Demand for it surged following the massacre at the Lena Mile. There, on April 4th, some 500 striking workers were killed or wounded. So it was, and so it will be, declared Interior Minister Makarov at the State Duma.
From Paris, Lenin and Krupskaya decided to move to Poland. As Nadezhda noted, the French police were raiding the Russian police in every way they could. They arrived in Krakow on June 9, 1912.
Nadezhda was ill throughout the winter, and her doctor recommended that she spend time in the mountains. So, as of spring 1913, the Ulyanovs were renting a house at the village of Bialy Dunyayets in the foothills of the Tatra Mountains. They were 260 miles from the Russian border. Illegal border crossing could easily be arranged. In September 22, professional revolutionaries met at Lenin's home. "There will be war," Vladimir Ilyich said on the eve of the conflict. "The capitalist world has reached a point of putrefactive ferment." The world had already been carved up. Over the previous 40 years, according to Lenin's calculation, the great powers had acquired territories whose area was more than 2.5 times that of Europe. Only one way remained to fight for the new colonies: war. The shot in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, triggered the First World War. All factions of the Fourth Duma, with the exception of the Bolsheviks, adopted the slogan, "Defend the Fatherland." Upon searching Lenin's home, Polish police found suspicious documents. He spent 2 weeks under arrest. In autumn of 1914, under the personal guarantee of the Swiss socialist politician Hermann Görlich, Vladimir Ilyich moved to Bern. Spring of 1915, German troops have taken Poland and a portion of the Baltics and Belarus. The Russian army is short on weapons. It has 4 million rifles, but over the course of war it would need 17 million.
On March 10th, the Ulyanovs laid Nadezhda's mother, Yelizaveta, to rest. "She was a trusted comrade who helped in all our work," Nadezhda recalled. She had always been a desperate smoker, and it was a holiday, so there was nowhere to buy tobacco. When Ilyich realized this, he said, "What a pity, I'll be right back with some." And off he went to scour the cafes for cigarettes, and having found some, brought them to my mother.
In August of 1915, a conference on socialists were held in Zimmerwald, Switzerland. Lenin proposed a slogan for the defeat of all governments, but the centrists felt differently. "If tomorrow we manage to gain control of a bourgeois state, we'll need to defend it." A Russian publishing house suggested that Vladimir Ilyich wrote a brochure entitled "Europe Before and During the War." He agreed, seeing an opportunity to speak his mind regarding Karl Kautsky's theory of ultra-imperialism, that is, the possibility of overcoming imperialism from within capitalism itself. He needed to consult the major libraries in Zurich. In late January of 1916, the Ulyanovs moved to Zurich, where they lived with the cobbler and his family. Lenin Finished Work was published as a separate book in April of 1917. Lenin objected to Kautsky's claim that ultra-imperialism would smooth over global conflict, writing that financial capital and trusts are not weakening, but indeed exacerbating the disparities in rates of growth among various spheres of global economy, and assuming that the balance of power has shifted, then what could possibly resolve these contradictions other than force? On March 2, 1917, the news reached Zurich by telegram. Nicholas II had abdicated the throne, the factories were in revolt, the soldiers were joining the workers' cause. Power in Petrograd was now shared by the Provisional Government and the Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. Lenin telegraphed a message to Petrograd: "Arming the proletariat is our only guarantee." On March 22nd, a train with 32 political exiles on board departed from the Zurich train station and arrived 3 days later in the German port city of Sassnitz. They were accompanied through Switzerland by Social Democrats from Stockholm. On April 2nd, the Russians departed for Petrograd from the Finnish border town of Tornio.
The soldiers, as Krupskaya recalled, were standing on the benches, the better to hear this man speaking so emphatically against the predatory war.
On the evening of April 3rd, the political exiles were triumphantly greeted at the Finland station. On April 4th, Vladimir Ilyich presented his April thesis in a speech at the Tauride Palace. He demanded that provisional government not be recognized, that the Republic of Soviets be founded, and that peace be declared with no annexation or indemnities. In an article entitled The Dual Power, Lenin compared the Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' deputies with the Paris Commune as two examples of the same kind of government. He called for overthrowing provisional government, which was capable of delivering neither peace, nor bread, nor complete freedom. Vladimir Ilyich gave many speeches at factories, at army barracks, but for the time being both executive committees, the Petrograd and the All Russian committees, consisted of the Social Revolutionaries and Mensheviks. On July 4th, the dual power came to an end. Demonstrators who marched to the Tauride Palace under the slogan "All Power to the Soviets" were saluted with the gunfire by Cossacks and military school pupils. The following morning, Central Committee member Yakov Sverdlov informed Lenin that the Pravda had been shut down. For several days, Vladimir Ilyich remained in hiding in the apartments of various Bolsheviks. Russia's war expenditures had already surpassed 20 billion rubles. On July 7th, the social revolutionary Alexander Kerensky took the reins of the provisional government. Though he served as a chair of the Central Economic Committee, all of his plans would remain on paper, unrealized. Meanwhile, the government gave the order to arrest Lenin. On July 9th, he moved to the Lake Rozliv, where he lived with the worker Nikolai Yemelyanov. He lived at first in a hayloft and later in a hayfield along the shore of the lake. It was from this location that Lenin led the 6th Bolshevik Congress, which gathered in semi-legal fashion in Petrograd. On July 26, the Congress charted a path toward revolution. As the winter cold set in, the revolutionary Alexander Shotman and the Finnish worker Aino Rachia were entrusted with the task of smuggling Lenin into Finland. They prepared a false ID for him under the name of a worker Konstantin Ivanov. Taking an erratic course through the outskirts of Petrograd and Finnish villages, Vladimir Ilyich arrived in Helsinki, then called Helsingfors, on August the 10th. The locomotive operator Hugo Jallova disguised him as a stoker, while some Finnish amateur actors dressed him up as a pastor. As the underground period drew to a close, Lenin completed the book The State and the Revolution, the apogee of his struggle for Marxist theory of the proletarian state. He points out a mistaken understanding of class struggle as central to the teaching of Marx. Even the bourgeois would accept it. Only he can be considered a Marxist, Vladimir Ilyich emphasized, who extends his acknowledgement of the class struggle to an acknowledgement of the dictatorship of the proletariat. In his letters and articles, Lenin demanded that the revolution should take place regardless of when the Congress of Soviets was to be held. Power is always taken by force, he argued. It is never transferred from one class to another by a decree. In his memoirs, Kerensky describes the two agents of Lenin active in Petrograd on his behalf as follows. Trotsky was charged with the technicalities of preparing for revolution and with political agitation. Meanwhile, Kamenev was given the task of distracting the socialist parties from Lenin's true aims. Kamenev carried out that task brilliantly. On September 23rd, Vladimir Ilyich moved to Vyborg, where he was hosted by the journalist Juho Latuka. At Latuka recalled, Ilyich was particularly incensed by the newspapers of the monarchist Black Hundreds. After all, they appeared to those forces that were capable of mounting a counter-revolution. In early October, Lenin and Rachia made it to Petrograd. The workers claimed, as Rachia wrote, that Lenin was the one protecting the workers' interests. The bourgeois were unanimous in their belief that Lenin had to be killed. The poor wretched had no idea that the men they condemned to death was already right under their noses. On October 8th, Lenin sent a letter to the Central Committee detailing how the Bolsheviks were viewed by the German revolutionaries. They might well say to us, "You Russian revolutionary internationalists have half a year of unrestricted agitation behind you, 24 newspapers, an entire array of workers and soldiers, Soviets, and still you won't manage to overthrow that imperialist of yours, Kerensky." On October 10th, the party's Central Committee adopted a resolution. An armed uprising is inevitable and is on the verge of fruition. October 24th, the apartment of the Bolshevik Margarita Fofanova.
Вы с ума сошли! Сегодня восстание. Вы что, не знали? Мы назначили на сегодня восстание. Оно идет сейчас, сию минуту. А я буду сидеть здесь?
That evening, Lenin, disguised with makeup, arrived at Smolny Institute and assumed leadership of the revolution. By the morning of October 25th, armed revolutionary detachments had seized the bridges, the telegraph office, the train stations, and the state bank. That same morning, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets began at Smolny Institute. As midnight approached, soldiers, sailors, and Red Guards attacked the Winter Palace. The provisional government was deposed. On the eve of October 27th, at a session of Congress of Soviets, Lenin presented drafts of his decree on peace and decree on land. The Congress was supported by the Soviet of People's Commissars, Sovnarkom, and the new All-Russian Central Executive Committee. The left socialist revolutionaries headed by Marina Spiridonova refused to join the government. "We departed, headed we knew not where," wrote the Menshevik Nikolai Sukhanov in his memoirs. "We departed having completely freed the hands of the Bolsheviks, having left open to them the entire arena of the revolution." The first dawn of socialism. Things looked just the same as yesterday. The same old streetcars, except for one thing. Power was concentrated not in the Winter Palace, nor in the Tauride Palace, but in room 67 of the Smolny Institute. Lenin was now the chairman of the Soviet of People's Commissars and of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee. Within a few days, the Soviet government had established itself in major industrial cities. By the year's end, it would gain a foothold in the Urals, the Siberia, and in distant corners of the empire. Kerensky was in hiding in Pskov. He directed General Krasnov's cavalry to march on the capital. He was beaten back by the sailors. This strengthened the position of the Sovnarkom in its negotiations with the left socialist revolutionaries and the railroad workers who were threatening a general strike. 4 portfolios within the government were entrusted to the left socialist revolutionaries. The rest were held by Bolsheviks, by Lenin's close associates. The writer Ivan Skvortsov-Stepanov, translator of Marx's Capital, the Petersburg metal worker Alexander Shlyapnikov, fluent in 3 languages, the commander-in-chief of the Russian army, warrant officer Nikolai Krylenko, Alexander Kollontai, the former liaison of the Russian Socialist Democratic Labor Party in Scandinavia, Joseph Stalin, appointed People's Commissar for Nationalities, and Lev Trotsky, Commissar for Foreign Affairs, the art theorist Anatoly Lunacharsky, in total 18 People's Commissars. As an eyewitness to the revolution, an American colonel, Raymond Robbins, recalled that, if judged according to the number of books written by its members, the languages they spoke, and their level of culture and education, then the first Soviet of People's Commissars would rank above any cabinet of ministers in the world. Within its first month, the Sovnarkom and the All-Russian Central Executive Committee adopted 50 highly important directives. The Decree on Workers' Control, the Decree on 8-Hour Working Day, the Declaration of Rights of the People of Russia. Lenin personally delivered the Decree on the Independence of Finland to Per Svinhufvud. The Decree on the Arrest of Leaders of the Civil War. As Lenin remarked, we will crush the resistance of the proletariat class with all of the same means by which they crushed the proletariat. On January 5, 1918, the Russian Constituent Assembly opened at the Tauride Palace, consisting primarily of centrist socialist revolutionaries. They refused to acknowledge the Soviets' right to govern. On January 6, the gathering was dissolved by the decree of the Central Committee. On the German front, things stood as a stalemate. Peace negotiations were underway in Brest. On January 28th, they were interrupted by a telegram from Lev Trotsky, People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs. Neither peace, no war. The army was to be dissolved. The Germans renewed their advance. Lenin firmly declared, "I refuse to tolerate this for another second." At his insistence, the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed on March 3rd. Soviet Russia thereby lost Ukraine, part of the Baltics, and part of the Belarus. The party's extraordinary 7th Congress supported Lenin. Once German divisions had halted their advance, the entire countries orchestrated a march on Russia in accordance with their supposed zones of influence. In the north were English, French, and American units. In Siberia were insurgent Czechoslovakians who had paralyzed 6,000 kilometers of the Trans-Siberian Railway. The British were in the Caspian Sea and in Transcaucasia. In total, the interventionary forces numbered over 200,000 rifles and 100 ships. The Civil War might well have died down by spring of 1918, but the Entente threw weapons, equipment, and money onto dying embers of the counter-revolution. On March 11, 1918, the Soviet government was moved to Moscow. Lenin arranged an office and department in the Kremlin's Senate building. The peace with Germany jolted the left socialist revolutionaries. At the 5th Congress of the Soviets, their leader, Maria Spiridonova, appealed to the delegates to choose between disgraceful peace and holy war. Lenin responded that a breakdown of the Brest Treaty would in fact be supported by forces hostile to the working classes.
Наши оппоненты заведомо лгут, потому что у нас совершенно иная дилемма. Или тяжкий, унизительный мир, или гибель советской власти.
On July 6, two socialist revolutionaries assassinated the German ambassador Mirbach with a bomb. The Socialist Revolutionaries' Central Committee raised a revolt in Moscow. The Latvian Rifleman Division crushed the uprising. The Socialist Revolutionaries promised to no longer pursue power by force of arms. Yet on August 30th, they opened fire on an unsuspecting Lenin at the Mikkelson factory. The second gunshot wound proved especially dangerous for Lenin. The bullet had barely missed his vital organs. Gorky arrived from Petrograd. "Do you really think I'm arguing against the idea that we need the intelligentsia?" said Vladimir Ilyich. "But you must see how hostile they are, and it'll be their fault if we're forced to break a few too many eggs." In late September, Lenin first departed for the Gorky's estate. It was decided that the bullets should be removed later. Already on October 15th, he returned to Moscow and led a session in Sovnarkom. Officials have persuaded Lenin to stroll around Kremlin courtyard for all to see. A railway car loaded with potatoes had been delivered to Lenin. The decision was made to distribute 60 kilos each to the Council of People's Commissars members.
А почему здесь 2 пуда?
Вы, Надежда Константиновна и Мария Ильинична.
Они в Совнаркоме не работают.
The storm of revolution was gathering above Germany. On November 9th, Karl Liebknecht declared the Bavarian Soviet Republic. There was a general strike throughout southern Germany, and the entire navy was on the side of the revolution. But the rightist social democrat Friedrich Ebert, in collusion with the military's top brass, suppressed the communists. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were brutally murdered by Freikorps. In those days, Lenin wrote, "Europe's greatest woe and danger lies in its lack of revolutionary party. Its only parties are those of traitors or of those with souls of lackeys." Hunger threatened the capital. 9/10 of the harvest lay in regions occupied by counter-revolutionaries. A single worker's ration consisted of 220 grams of bread per day. Lenin appeals to the People Commissar for Food Alexander Tsurupa.
Если мы решили правильным, а по-моему правильно, то почему же при диктатуре пролетариата пролетариат гибнет с голоду? В чем дело? Почему?
So-called food brigades of Petrograd workers were sent to the villages. At first, surplus grain was purchased. Later, under a January 19th decree of food distribution, it was simply seized. 200 kilograms was left for every mouth to feed. Hundreds of food brigade soldiers were shot by kulaks. On March 16, Yakov Sverdlov died from influenza. Lenin remarked that he had always made the acquaintance of Sverdlov's skillfully chosen recruits not in salons and at banquets, but as was usual in the West, but in prisons and during prison transfers in Siberia and in the underground. At Krupskaya's request, Lenin spoke to school teachers. In a ruined country, he said, the first task is to save the worker. The worker, the laborer, is the primary productive power of all of humanity. If he survives, we'll save and restore everything. Lenin debunked Karl Kautsky's new theory for a pure democracy, without the use of revolutionary force by the oppressed class. The world record has been broken, he wrote, when it comes to a liberal misrepresentation of Marx. Vladimir Ilyich hurried to found the Third Communist International. It was declared in the Kremlin on March 5, 1919, by delegates from 35 foreign parties. Lenin would see 4 Comintern congresses during his lifetime. During the fourth, in 1922, he drew the bottom line. We've yet to understand what approach we should take in presenting our Russian experiences to foreigners. Everything that has been said has remained a dead letter. Vladimir Ilyich patiently tried to persuade with the left-leaning communist delegates that the triumph of the revolution required not a determined minority, but a decisive majority of the proletariat. He considered a flawed theory of attack to have been cause of the rapid suppression of the Hungarian Soviet Republic and the Bavarian Soviet Republic in the spring of 1919. In August of 1919, the British Secretary of State, Churchill, announced an armed invasion of Russia by 14 countries. They were joined by restorers of order within Russia, Admiral Kolchak in Siberia and Orenburg region, General Denikin in the south, and General Krasnov on the Don River. Lenin declared a decisive battle between the socialism and bourgeois society. Slightest hesitation among the socialists would reduce them to the role of pawns in the hands of British and French generals. Vladimir Ilyich's 50th birthday passed with little fanfare on April 22, 1920. He was not a widely recognized figure. No biographical booklets or flyers had been written about him. Lenin was visited by H.G. Wells. As the writer recalled, Lenin claimed that capitalism was the eternal competition and struggle for profit. Capitalism cannot grow into a cohesive social unit. Vladimir Ilyich was obsessed with plans for electrification. For a start, he demanded that each village reading room and village council have at least one light bulb. Together with Nadezhda, he visited the peasants in the village of Kashina in the Moscow Governorate for the opening of the local electric station. The locals recalled that he spoke with us without affectations, like a real son of peasant. Beginning in the fall of 1919, the Red Army was victorious in all fronts. Denikin's divisions had been turned back, and Yudenich's troops had been expelled from the outskirts of Petrograd. Kolchak's army was defeated. 45,000 of his soldiers and officers were captured and taken as prisoners. Wrangel's forces in the Tavrichesky Governorate were destroyed, and the Crimea was liberated. By November of 1920, throughout most of the country, the civil war was over. That fall, Clara Tsetkin visited Lenin in his Kremlin apartment. She had not seen Nadezhda for 5 years and recorded their meeting as follows.
With her hair combed smoothly back, in her simple dress, she gave the impression of an exhausted worker's wife, eternally worried about somehow managing to get everything done, about not wasting any time.
Grain requisitions resulted in peasant uprising in Siberia and Altai. In Moscow and Petrograd there were calls for strikes. In Kronstadt there was unrest amongst the sailors, whose slogan was, "For Soviets without communists." There were more in the government who disagreed with Lenin than there had been during the Smolny era. A group called the Workers' Opposition, led by Alexander Kollontai and Alexander Shlapnikov, demanded that the People's Commissariat for Food and other bodies be abolished and that the party end its involvement in the economy. The Soviet government, Lenin shot back, was wobbling precisely because of the economic weakness, but the experience of all the Europe nations shows results from relying on health measures. On February 8, 1921, Lenin submitted to the Central Committee a draft of thesis on the peasantry in which he proposed replacing the food surplus requisitioning system with taxation. On March 15th, at the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party, the Bolsheviks, he declared, "We need to pose our questions starkly. These classes do not share the same interests. What the small-time farmer wants is not the same thing as what the worker wants." The Congress adopted the resolution to replace the requisitions with food tax and to transition the new economy to the NEP. On March 18th, Michael Tukhachevsky's 7th Army succeeded in the second attempt to storm Kronstadt. The campaign was joined by 300 volunteers, all delegates from the Congress. Following the 10th Congress, the Central Committee issued a decree establishing taxation in kind, permitting private trade, setting up stock exchanges and concessions, and allowing for the lease of small enterprises and land plots. Heavy industry remained in the hands of the government, the metal industry, the machine building industry, and the oil, mining, and cement industries. The NEP did not directly affect the railways, but as Lenin assistant Vladimir Bonch-Bruyevich recalled, they attracted a great number of fly-by-night entrepreneurs. They circulated stolen goods and dispatched shipments to profiteers. Lenin appointed Felix Dzerzhinsky as the People's Commissars for Railways. The tremendous expanse of the Volga River basin, with a population of 30 million, was wrecked by hunger. The field kitchens of Friedhof Nansen's Red Cross and the US-based AIDS societies reached only 1 person in 10. But in the fall of 1921, the area sown with winter crops in the hunger-stricken governorates was significantly higher. Pre-war levels of grain harvest would be restored by 1925. Lenin received Parley Christensen, who was sent by the American Farmer Labor Party to discuss food aid. Lenin Guest admitted that in Denmark, when he had declared in public that the Bolsheviks weren't criminals, they'd almost killed me. This is the atmosphere we're surrounded by, said Vladimir Ilyich at the 9th Congress of Soviets.
The long, difficult years of emigration, recalled Lydia Fotieva, secretary of the Sovnarkom. The aftermath of his wounds, his overexhaustion from a superhuman strain, had all undermined Vladimir Ilyич's health. By late 1921, he had begun to suffer from intense headaches and chronic insomnia. Lenin worked without sparing himself in the least.
Gorky wrote, "I don't know what he inspired more of in people, love or hatred. The hatred felt toward him was nakedly and repulsively obvious. Its dark, plague-ridden sores glistened everywhere. But I also fear that people's love for Lenin was, for many, just a superstitious faith, the kind of love that expects a miracle while itself doing nothing." March 1922. The new economic plan had been in place for a year. Lenin assessed it. "We see very clearly and make no attempt to conceal that new economic plan is a retreat. We had gone further than it was sustainable." In late March, the 11th Congress of the Communist Party adopted a resolution regarding the diminishing return of concessions to capitalism. This Congress was the last in which Lenin was involved. The plenum of the Central Committee elected him as a member of the Politburo and Joseph Stalin as General Secretary. There had never been firsts among equals in the Bolshevik Party. The position was deemed purely technical in nature. Far away from Moscow, a new international fault line emerged as Genoa Conference. 28 countries demanded that Soviet Russia assumed 18 billion golden rubles worth of Tsarist debts. The counterclaim was twice that amount as compensation for losses during intervention. The conference brought no results. In the second half of May, Lenin left for the Gorky estate, a bit lighter now with one of the bullets removed. Here, on May 27th, he suffered his first stroke related to sclerosis of blood vessels in the brain. The doctors hovered around them for 4 months. Eventually, they allowed their patient to stroll around the garden, to read newspapers and documents, and to receive visitors. On October 3rd, Lenin held a meeting of the Sovnarkom. As Professor Nikolai Semashko wrote, if it weren't for Vladimir Ilyich cast iron construction, he would never have survived his serious wounds following that social revolutionary woman's attempt on his life. But on December 12th, Lenin visited his office for the last time. He soon suffered additional strokes. Though his doctors advised him to move back to the Gorky estate, he remained in Moscow. On December 30th, the first Congress of Soviets of the USSR was held in the Bolshoi Theater. Vladimir Ilyich was chosen as its honorary chairman. The Congress passed the declaration and agreement of the formation of the USSR. Moscow was to be its capital. Following the 12th Party Congress in April 1923, the national economy shifted toward greater concentration and strengthening of production. By 1925, the industrial production would reach 75% of pre-war volumes, and workers' pay would grow by a third. This would finally be enough bread, meat, and milk for workers' families. Vladimir Ilyich declared the winter and spring of 1923 for his political testament, a series of letters that he dictated. In his letter to the Congress, he recommended expanding the party's Central Committee to include 50 to 100 people and to increase its percentage of workers. "I believe," he wrote, "that the workers could form a contingent of dedicated supporters of the Soviet order." In his pages from a diary, Lenin pointed out that only a third of the country's population was literate. This should serve as a note of caution and a reproach to those who delude themselves with some idealized notion of proletarian culture. In mid-May of 1923, Lenin moved to Gorky. That summer, his health improved and the doctor's oversight grew less strict. The workers of the Gluchovskaya factory brought him a gift, cherry tree seedlings. They left a letter as well, greeting to our dear comrade and leader, and many years of good health. In the early days of January 1924, Vladimir Ilyich would stroll in the park, read newspapers and watch movies. He joined in the children's New Year's festivities, but on January 20th, he failed to come down for breakfast and declined his usual stroll. On January 21, at 5:50 in the afternoon, Vladimir Ilyich died from acute respiratory paralysis. On the morning of January 23rd, those at Gorky said their goodbyes to Lenin. They carried his coffin to the station on foot, 4 kilometers away. Hundreds of thousands of Muscovites would see it at the House of the Unions. On that very day, a massive surge in applications for party membership began. Within 4 months, its ranks would swell by 250,000 people. Red Square, January 27th, at 4 in the afternoon.
Allons enfants de la patrie, le jour de gloire est arrivé. Contre nous de la tyrannie, l'étendard sanglant élevé, l'étendard sanglant élevé. Entendez-vous dans les campagnes mugir ces féroces soldats? Jusque dans nos bras, égorger nos fils, nos combats.